So we're continuing with chapter 2 of part 1 of individuation in light of notions of form and information. So last week we saw the discussion of the crystallization, allotropic forms of crystals. So sulfur, for example, has two different crystalline structures, and one is more stable than the other in the sense that a crystal formed in one crystalline structure can be transformed into a crystal of the other form, but not vice versa. So the one form turns into the other, but not in the other way around. And this crystallization process is the sort of paradigm for physical individuation for Simondon. So it's always, physical individuation is always a transformation of potential energy into structure, basically, so that an unstructured field or fluid or whatever it is appears. And so that's what we're going to be continuing on with today, and what that means for individuation. So I think we're at the top of 73, so I can start. And we're in the middle of one of these giant multi-page paragraphs, so I'll just read about a page and then we'll stop to discuss. In this sense, the individuality of a particular being rigorously includes the type as well as the characteristics capable of varying within a type. We should never consider a certain particular being as belonging to a type. The type is what belongs to the particular being just as much as the details that singularize it the most, since the existence of the type in this particular being results from the same conditions as those at the origin of the details that singularize the being. There are types because these conditions vary discontinuously by the limiting domains of stability, but because within these domains of stability certain parameters, which are part of the conditions, vary more finely, each particular being is different from a certain number of others. The original particularity of a being is not different in nature from its typological reality. The particular being does not possess its most singular characteristics any more so than its typological characteristics. Both the former and the latter are individual because they result from the encounter of energetic conditions and singularities, the latter of which are historical and local. If, within the interior of the same domain of stability, conditions that are still variable are not capable of an infinity of values but merely a finite number of values, it will have to be acknowledged that the number of effectively different beings able to appear is finite. In a certain quantity of substance, there could then be several identical beings that seem indiscernible. Certainly, on the macrophysical level, we hardly ever encounter several indiscernible individuals, even in crystallization. Furthermore, a substance in crystalline supercooling ends up transforming into the stable form relative to which it is metastable. But we should not forget that if we find ourselves in the presence of a large quantity of elements, nothing can guarantee the absolute purity of an allotropic form. A certain number of germs of the stable allotropic form can exist within a substance that appears to have a single form. Particular local conditions can be equivalent to the structural germ. For example, a trace of chemical impurity. Ultimately, to consider simple substance, we must therefore take the microscopic point of view. At this level, it seems that there can be veritable indiscernibles. So here we have continuing discussion from what we saw last week of the relationship between individuation and species, or between individual and species. And Simondon criticizes in several places, in addition to this one, the notion or the method of classifying entities by genus and species. And so here, what he's criticizing is the idea that we have to abstract from the individual to arrive at a species, which would be a certain number of properties, like a bundle of shared properties between different individuals, and then abstract further to reach a genus and so on. And he argues instead that we should understand the different types of, for example, stone geological formations that you can classify by species and type, species and genus. We should understand them instead in terms of the history of their formation. So a certain type of lava flow will solidify in a certain way, so that you have a certain crystalline structure or a certain mixture of different crystalline structures, and that's a historical particularity to that one particular lava flow. And so the properties of the entity are not sort of generic or abstractions from the individual, but they're part of what constitute the individual through its history. And so this paragraph here that we just read, he's arguing that the typological characteristics, so the characteristics that make this entity belong to a certain type or a certain species, are not distinct from the particular characteristics that make it this one individual. So all of these characteristics are all the results of the historical process of physical individuation. But that also means that because there are only a finite number of different possible states that the physical individual can take on, that means that there can be indiscernibles at this level. So entities that would have the same properties that would not be physically distinct in that sense. But we'll see more discussion of that as we continue.
So I guess one thing he's talking about here, I mean, this discussion of types, it's reminding me of the problem of universals. And I think that was big in medieval philosophy. Are there universals, and what are universals? And I guess another word for them would be forms, types, universals, or species, like a kind of a one over many type of entity. And it seems like he's saying here, technically speaking, there are no such things. There are only particulars. And sort of the process of development of those, or kind of unfolding and genesis of those particulars. But then he gives a very, a very kind of complicated picture of how these particulars develop and relate to one another. And I guess it seems like that could appear as if there were these types that were just kind of separate forms, but that's really not the case.
Yeah, I think I would want to specify this in a slightly different way, in the sense that so it's not that types don't exist; it's that types or species or forms or whatever you want to call them only exist through the particularity of the entities that fall under those species or types. So I'm just trying to find that quote here. Right. So at the top of 73, so in that bit that we just read, in this sense, the individuality of a particular being rigorously includes the type as well as the characteristics capable of varying within a type. So the point here is that there isn't some sort of ontological distinction between the type or species on the one hand, and then the individual, the particular properties, the properties that are particular to that individual, the variation within the type. There isn't any sort of distinction at the ontological status between those two sets of characteristics. Because that type of distinction between species, the properties that are characteristic of a species, and then the properties that are particular to an individual, that distinction sort of aligns with the hylomorphic schema of form and matter. You have the form, which corresponds with the species, humanity or hoarseness or whatever it is, and that's imposed on a form. Imposed on a matter that gives the particularity of that form. This exact height and weight and color and so on. So Simondon is not so much saying that there are no properties characteristic of a species, but rather that there's no ontological distinction between those properties and the properties that are that make up the particularity of that individual. So all of the properties are the result of a process of individuation, a historical process that it's localized in space and time. And it has that evental character, so it's the result of an encounter of some kind between the germ and the conditions that are sort of the background for the individuation process. And and the properties that we can use some of those properties to classify entities into species and genus and so on. But those properties are not ontologically distinct from the other properties that we don't use for that purpose. So there's a sort of epistemological use of the concepts of species and genus, but it has no ontological status, I guess. And so the existence of types, or the utility of classifying entities according to types or species and genus, has to do with what we saw just at the end of last week, the discontinuity of the states, or discreteness of the states in which individuation can result. So in the case of the sulfur, for example, there are only two crystalline structures that it can result in. So there's a discontinuity between those two different structures. Even though there's a transition from one to the other, the actual states themselves are discontinuous. There's no intermediate state. And so it's because different substances have these finite sets of states that they can take on. Because of that, it can be useful to classify entities in terms of species and genus, because they fall under one of these states or another. But that classification is not doesn't have an ontological status, in the sense that those states are not distinct from the other properties of the entity that are particular to one individual.
So that makes sense to me. Yeah. I guess what I'm curious about, so the reason types are usually introduced, right, as I understand it, is to account for the similarity of things. So if a number of particulars have a certain quality, let's say 4 legs and hoofs and a certain kind of tail, and we call them horse, and I guess the kind of the hypothesis is, well, there is this form, right, this sort of this similarity or this likeness that even precedes the individuals, right? That will be a kind of idealism. And I guess what I'm struggling to understand in Simondon's thinking, what takes the form of that sort of universal likeness or similarity? Like, so, because it seems like we can talk about types, right? And therefore there is like a meaningful similarity between things. And it seems like he would want to cash that out in terms of structure, in terms of, these discrete structurations that give that individuate the metastable pre-individual. But I guess I'm not seeing, like, how is that just not pushing the problem one step further? How can we speak of similarity of structure? And like this Platonic sort of questioning just keeps reemerging, it seems to me. And anyway, we don't have to like belabor this too much, but I'm having that question.
Actually, I have similar questions too, because 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6th line, it says we should never consider certain particular being as belonging to a type. So in a way, I'm thinking like it's like inductive reasoning, or Simondong is lay emphasis on conditions, like which could make variables of being. So instead of classifying or designating some particular type according to the interaction with conditions, there could be numerous types of being possible.
Yeah, I think Dreams, I think that's a good way of putting the question, and or it's a good question to pose to Simondon. And I think, Ollie, I think you're right to compare this to an inductive mode of reasoning, in the sense that we start, rather than starting from something general and then deducing downwards to the particular case, we're starting from the particular, and then extracting the types from it. But the difference here, the reason why this is not exactly the same type of procedure as inductive reasoning, is that in inductive reasoning you have a complementarity between the comprehension and the extension of concepts. So the more content that a concept has, or the more the richer the concept is, the more properties you're attributing through the use of that concept, then the fewer entities it holds of. And then conversely, a concept that applies to more entities will have less content, will be less rich or less determined. So in the same way that horse has more content than mammal, you're attributing more properties to an entity when you call it a horse than when you call it a mammal. But at the same time, mammal covers more entities than horse does. And so the inductive mode of reasoning always it has that complementarity between extension and content of a concept. And what we're doing here, or what Simondon is describing here, is not quite the same procedure of abstraction and generalization, because that line that you quoted there, where he says we should never consider a certain particular being as belonging to a type. What he goes on to say right after is the type is what belongs to the particular being, just as much as the details that singularize it the most, since the existence of the type in this particular being results from the same conditions as those at the origin of the details that singularize the being. So it's an inversion of perspective, I guess we can say, is that rather than abstracting from the details of the entity to produce a general concept that covers more entities, what we're looking at is the which properties have this discreteness to them. They exist only in a finite discrete number of states, like the crystalline structure of sulfur, for example, whereas other properties have a continuous, or at least a more finely grained variation. And then those ones can characterize an entity as a particular. So it's rather than abstracting from certain properties to account for or to produce a general concept, what we're doing is looking at the properties and seeing which ones have this discreteness to them, and therefore can be used for typology, or for defining types of entities, and then which ones have this property of fine-grainedness or continuity, which means that they can account for the particularity of individual entities. So that was sort of a long answer, but I think that's why what Simondon wants to do is different than a purely inductive approach to concept formation.
I got an idea. At the end of the day, Simondon wanted to guide us to transductive reasoning. I'm happy to read the parts like he concretized like inductive reasoning, but at the end of the day, he will emphasize the process of so-called transduction, because inductive reasoning plus
Oh, we lost you again.
Sorry, he will lead us to the transductive reasoning.
I think we lost you again. You got to hold down that button.
I just said this part concretize Simon concretize the process of induction reasoning, but at the end of the day, he would lead us to the process of a transductive reasoning. So it's kind of like a come and go, on and off, like the process of between the deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning, and then at the altogether transductive reasoning, something like that.
Yeah, I think that's what I was trying to characterize without using that term. But yes, transductive reasoning is the type of thinking that Simondon tries to set out in this book as a whole, and so that distinction from inductive reasoning in the sense that it doesn't have this abstraction from the particular. So that's one of the characteristics of transductive reasoning is that it doesn't proceed through this abstraction from the particular, this reduction of the comprehension as the extension grows. But another characteristic of transductive thinking is precisely that it's ontological at the same time as epistemological, so that the transduction characterizes both our thinking and the entities themselves, the individuation or the genesis of the entities. So it's the same process going on in our thinking as in the entities. And so here we're looking at it in this passage that we're reading. We're looking at the transductive process going on in entities, and the mode of thinking should correspond with that. And so that's another reason why we don't want to use classification into species and genus, because it doesn't correspond to the genesis of the entities in the same way.
Yeah, thank you. That helps me to understand. Thank you.
Just a quick follow-up. I think this is a really important point. And Non, just wanted to clarify something that you were talking about discreteness and continuity earlier, and it sounded like you were saying discreteness accounts for the types and generality, whereas continuity accounts for the singularity of an individual. Is that on the right track?
Yes, I think I would say that's on the right track. But the way I would specify it is, or the way I would want to put it is that what we're doing when we attribute a type to an entity, or the validity of that operation, why it has value to try to predicate a type of an entity, is because certain properties have that discreteness to them, that they only take on a certain finite number of states. And then the other side is the other properties have this continuity, or at least a finer grain than the first ones. And so we can account for the particularity of entities using these fine-grained properties. But what we have to avoid is setting up some sort of ontological distinction between these two types of properties, as though entities have the discrete properties sort of imposed on them from without, or something like that, rather than just seeing certain properties, seeing all of the properties as the result of the historical process of individuation, and then some of those properties being discrete and others being continuous. But I think we should go on so we don't get stuck on one passage for the whole session today. So if someone else would like to read the next couple paragraphs.
At the level where individuality seems to be the least accentuated, in the allotropic forms of the same element, it is not merely linked to the identity of a substance, the singularity of a form, or the action of a force. A pure substantialism, a pure theory of form, or a pure dynamism would be equally powerless facing the necessity of accounting for physico-chemical individuation. To seek the principle of individuation in matter, form, or force is to be condemned to only explaining individuation in these seemingly simple particulars, like, for example, that of the molecule or the atom. Instead of constituting the individual's genesis, this would be to suppose this genesis as already formed in the formal, material, or energetic elements, and due to these elements already harboring individuation, to generate through composition and individuation that is in fact simpler. This is why we have not wanted to undertake the study of the individual by beginning with the elementary particles so as to mistake such a complex case as being simple. We have chosen the most precarious aspect of individuation as the first term of the examination. And from the very beginning, it has seemed to us that this individuation was an operation resulting from the encounter and compatibility between a singularity and an energetic and material conditions. The name allegmatic could be given to such a genetic method that seeks to grasp individuated beings as a singularity that unifies on an intermediate order of magnitude the overall energetic conditions and material conditions. In fact, we should note that this method does not involve a pure causal determinism through which a being would be explained when its genesis in the past would have to be accounted for. In fact, the being extends time in the meeting of the two groups of conditions that it expresses. It is not just the result, but also the agent, both the milieu of this meeting and the extension of this realized compatibility. In terms of time, the individual is not in the past, but in the present, for it only continues to conserve its individuality to the extent that this constitutive combination of conditions persists in and is extended by the individual itself. The individual exists such that the mixture of matter and energy that constitutes it is in the present. This is what could be called the active consistency of the individual. This is why every individual can be a condition of becoming. A stable crystal can be the germ for a metastable substance in a state of crystalline or liquid supercooling. Dynamism alone cannot account for individuation because dynamism wants to explain the individual through a single fundamental dynamism. Yet the individual doesn't just harbor a hylomorphic encounter, it stems from a process of amplification unleashed in a hylomorphic situation by a singularity, and it extends this singularity. We could just as legitimately call a hylomorphic situation that in which there is a certain quantity of matter grouped into subsets of a system isolated with respect to one another, or a certain quantity of matter in which the energetic conditions and spatial distribution are such that the system is in a metastable state. The state containing forces of tension, of potential energy, can be called the system's form, insofar as its dimensions, its topology, and its internal isolations are what maintain these forces of tension. A form is the system as far as it is macrophysical and insofar as it is a reality that envelops a possible individuation. Matter is the system envisioned at the microphysical molecular level. Should I read this next small paragraph too?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. A hylomorphic situation is a situation in which there is nothing but form and matter, and therefore two levels of reality without communication. The establishment of this communication between levels with energetic transformations is the initiation of individuation. It supposes the appearance of a singularity, which could be called information, and which either comes from the outside or is subjacent.
Right. So here in this passage, we have, I think this is the first time that he uses the term allegmatic, or if it's not the first time, it's at least one of the first times, and where he sets out the meaning of the term as well. So let me just find that passage again here, about a third of the way down on 74. The The name allegmatic could be given to such a genetic method that seeks to grasp individuated beings as the development of a singularity that unifies on an intermediate order of magnitude the overall energetic conditions and material conditions, and then extending from there. But yeah, so that allegmatic method has to do with grasping an entity through its process of individuation, resulting from the encounter between a singularity and the energetic and material conditions, and then the formation of an intermediate order of magnitude between those two. So the allegmatic method, I'm not sure if we should take allegmatic method and transductive method as synonymous, or if one is a subset of the other. That would be something interesting to look at as we continue reading. But they're obviously related in terms of the concept of the one and the other. Yeah, for allegmatic, we can read genetic, I think, as a synonym as well. And then we also have here some discussion of time again, which came up in the introduction to the work, and the notion that individuation is always in the present, or more, even further, he thinks that individuation is what constitutes the present. So time is the result of individuation rather than being sort of the form in which individuation occurs. So in the case of physical individuation, the actual process of individuation is a relatively short time. There's a relatively short individuation process, and then afterwards we have an individual as a result, which is sort of dead in that sense. It can only degrade in terms of individuality from there. But when we get to vital individuation, we'll see that it consists in, or one of its essential properties is that the individuation process is extended, so that a living being is always in the process of individuating itself, and so it's always in the present in that sense, whereas a physical individual has a relatively brief present, and then it exists in the past, in the sense that it's no longer individuating.
Something I'm wondering about this passage is, I guess it's the connection, relationship, Simon, of his thinking to this larger theory. Because it seems to me like he's not a structure, right? That would not be a good way of characterizing him. And I'm wondering if these comments he makes here about pure determinism, they may be in some way about different structuralism. Because one thing I understand, I mean, structuralism, I guess, is really broad. It's a broad term, kind of vague. But in my understanding, one aspect of it was determinism of these structural laws, whether they're linguistic or whether. Yeah, and I know in Deleuze this question comes up: how the Simondonian way of thinking brought together with structuralism. But I guess I'm curious what Simondon's own stance was, because that was very much, it was very much the prevalent way of thinking.
Yeah, that would be an interesting question to look into more. What the relationship is between Simondon and structuralism. I think, in terms of chronology, I think this book is like a little bit before structuralism sort of takes over in France. So this is 1960, I believe, is when, this book has a sort of a strange publication history, but the first part of the book was published in 1960, I think. but it's only a little bit later that we start seeing, like, Lacan's Écrit is 1966, and that becomes like a bestseller for some strange reason. And I'm just trying to think of Lévi-Strauss. I can't remember the timeline for some of his writings, but yeah, so it's, I think, in sort of like the mid 60s that structuralism starts to become really predominant within the French Academy. I'm not sure when he talks about determinism here. I'm not sure if he has in mind something like structuralism. I think he's thinking more of a physical determinism. An account of physical reality that would say that the present is determined by the past. So once you have the past conditions, then that would explain the present, and there would be no need. There'd be nothing like a genesis of the present, or the genesis of novelty in the present. Whereas Simondon wants to oppose to that conception, instead a conception in which the process of genesis, or the process of individuation, is a development of novelty. So there's something like an invention in individuation, which is sort of attenuated at the level of physical individuation, but is much more present at the level of vital individuation. So that living beings are inventive, in the sense, not just at the level of behavior, but at the level of their physiology as well. So yeah, there's an opposition between this physical determinism, like the Laplace type of account, where you can predict the future based on the past, if you have precise enough measurements of the past conditions. He wants to oppose that conception to a conception in which there is this a true present, or a true creation of novelty in the present, an inventiveness of individuation. Okay, so I think we can go on to the next long paragraph, which is another one of these ones that was cut out of the initial publication of the book, of the first half of the book. So remember, this was originally Simondon's thesis, and then the first half was published, I think 1960. I'd have to check that. And then the second half was published in 1989, and then it was only in 2005 that the whole thing was published together, along with the complementary texts in the second volume of the translation. But yeah, so we can go on to the next paragraph if someone else would like to read.
However, the individual conceals two fundamental dynamisms, one of which is energetic and the other of which is structural. The individual stability is the stability of their association. Right away, the following question can then be posed concerning the degree of reality such an investigation could lay claim to. Should we consider such an investigation to be capable of attaining and grasping a real? Or is this sort of investigation not, on the contrary, subjected to this relativity of knowledge that seems to characterize the experimental sciences? In order to respond to this need for examination, it is necessary to distinguish the knowledge of phenomena from the knowledge of the relations between states. Relativistic phenomenalism is perfectly valid to the extent that it indicates our incapacity to absolutely know a physical being, at least without recreating its genesis and relative to the manner in which we know or believe to know the subject in the isolation of self-consciousness. But what remains at the basis of the critique of knowledge is this postulate that being is fundamentally substance, i.e., in itself and for itself. The critique of pure reason is essentially addressed to the substantialism of Leibniz and Wolff, Through the latter, this postulate affects all substantialisms, and those of Descartes and Spinoza. The Kantian noumenon is not unrelated to the substance of rationalist and realist theories. But if we refuse to admit that being is fundamentally substance, the analysis of the phenomenon can no longer lead to the same relativism. The conditions of sensory experience indeed prevent a knowledge of physical reality through intuition. But we cannot deduce as definitively as Kant a relativism of the existence of a priori forms of sensibility. If noumena are indeed not pure substance, but also consist of relations, like exchanges of energy or passages of structures from one domain of reality to another domain of reality, and if relation has the same status of reality as the terms themselves, as we have tried to show in the preceding examples, insofar as relation is not an accident relative to a substance, but a constitutive, energetic, and structural condition that is extended in the existence of constituent beings, then the a priori forms of sensibility that allow us to grasp relations because they are a power of organizing according to succession or according to simultaneity, do not create an irremediable relativity of knowledge. If relation effectively has the value of truth, then both the relation within the subject and the relation between the subject and the object can have the value of reality. True knowledge is a relation, not a simple formal rapport comparable to the rapport of two figures between them. True knowledge is knowledge that corresponds to the greatest possible stability in the given conditions of the subject-object relation. There can be different levels of knowledge, just as there can be different degrees of stability of a relation. There can be a type of knowledge that is the most stable possible for a certain subjective condition in a certain objective condition. If a later modification of subjective conditions, for example, the discovery of new mathematical relations, or objective conditions turns up, the old type of knowledge can become metastable with respect to a new type of knowledge. The rapport of the inadequate to the adequate is in fact that of the metastable relative to the stable. Truth and error are not opposed as two substances, but are opposed as a relation enveloped in a stable state to a relation enveloped in a metastable state. Knowledge is not a rapport between an object substance and a subject substance, but a relation between two relations, one of which is in the domain of the object, and the other of which is in the domain of the subject.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going back through the text a little bit. So what we have here is an epistemological reflection on what we've just seen in the text, and a rejection of phenomenalist or Kantian epistemology. When he talks about phenomenalism here, he's talking about there were a number of early 20th century philosophers who argued that we can only have relative knowledge of phenomena because we can only understand we can only sort of measure or map the relations between the phenomena, but we can never have a sort of absolute knowledge of what those phenomena are, of what the entities are themselves. So we have our sensations, and then we can generate laws that allow us to predict the evolution of those sensations, and so we can understand the relations between entities through those laws, but we can't have any absolute knowledge of what those entities are in themselves. And so it's this type of argument that that Simondon is criticizing here. And so he argues that that type of relativism or relativistic phenomenalism, it presupposes that entities are substances. That is, that they have a self-subsistent existence. They exist in themselves, and relation is something secondary, or that it is not a fundamental property of those entities. It's external to their being. And then he wants us to reframe our understanding of epistemology, our understanding of knowledge, by setting relation at the level of as having the status of being, so that relation is constitutive of the being of the entities that we want to know. And then if we reframe our understanding of knowledge in that sense, then knowledge is one relation among others. So there's a relation between the subject and object that we call knowledge. And then that relation can itself be, it can be in a metastable or a stable state. So it can be either, it can be such that it has to undergo transformation, or is susceptible of undergoing transformation if it's in a metastable state, or it can be such that it is not susceptible of undergoing transformation. Because knowledge is one relation, and relation has the status of being. Knowledge, true knowledge, as he characterizes it, is something that has the status of being, and so it's not purely relative. It's not outside of the being of the entities known, in the way that phenomenalism represented it. It's actually, knowledge is part of the being of the entities known, or of the total situation, encompassing both the knowing subject and the object known. No comments on this. I thought this was a particularly striking passage in the book, but no one else has any thoughts or questions or comments.
Well, it's definitely very juicy. I don't know if it's just me, but I found it really difficult to parse. And it also seems like he's saying something really important here, because this relation of relations seems to me like an important point. And if I remember correctly, actually, it's I have this vague sense of having seen that expression in Merleau-Ponty. Right, so just the last sentence. Knowledge is not a rapport between an object substance and a subject substance, but a relation between two relations. And it seems to me that he is looking for relativity, perhaps without a relativism, if that's a way of putting it.
Yeah, I'm not sure about Merleau-Ponty, whether this could be borrowed from him or not. I would have to. That's something that I'd have to look up and investigate more. But yeah, relativity without relativism. I think it would be one way of characterizing what he wants to do, because he our knowledge is relative in the sense that it is a relation. Knowledge is a relation, but it's not relative in the sense that relativity would be opposed to absolute knowledge, or knowledge of entities as they are in themselves. So he wants to reframe our understanding of knowledge, rather than being something external, which sort of puts into conjunction the subject and the object as two independent substances. We have to reframe our understanding of knowledge so that we understand it as being constitutive of the being of the total system, which includes both the subject and the object. So that the relation, and then the second sort of stage of the argument, or of the conception that he's presenting here, is that once we reframe our understanding of knowledge in that way, then we don't see truth and error as two sort of opposed substances or two opposed states. But we understand the passage from error to truth as a passage from a metastable state to a stable state. So true knowledge is knowledge that that has that quality of stability, or it's a relation that is in a stable state, and so it allows us to grasp the dynamism of knowledge, I guess we could say, or the way that knowledge passes from an inadequate to an adequate state or condition. So that's the second sort of reframing that he wants us to operate.
So please help me to clarify, like if you go back to a little bit early part of 75, I think that has to do, there is a part like a holomorphic, there is like 75, so holomorphic situation. As far as I understand, that it has to do with the Aristotle concept, like the matter and the form, the ensemble of the matter and form fixed. And then Simondon's position is against that, right? And then Simondon's position is also against some kind of idea flow of the Kant and Leibniz and so on. So what he emphasizes is like a relation, and through the relation, something new continue to be generated. So that's why knowledge is not the only one. It continues to be changing, something like that. But to be brief, Simondon's position is against, absolutely against Aristotle position and the Kantian position, Leibniz, and then things like that. It's kind of a ignorant question.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to point back towards that passage about hylomorphism, because the Kantian epistemology in particular is a hylomorphic epistemology. It's articulated in terms of matter coming through the senses, having a form imposed on it from the understanding. So knowledge is always consists of a matter and form combination for Kant. And so in the same way that that Simondon criticizes the hylomorphic schema when it comes to physical individuation, likewise we shouldn't apply a hylomorphic schema in epistemology in our understanding of knowledge. So we should, rather than having some conception of forms being imposed on matter in knowledge, or forms being imposed on the sensory data or something like that, we should have an understanding of the genesis of knowledge as a relation between subject and object, which has the status of being. So it's the genesis of knowledge is a process of individuation going on in the total system in which the subject and object exist. So it's knowledge has the status of being as well, and because of that, it's not there. We don't have this problem or this worry that the forms that we impose on the matter of knowledge are in some sense relative to us. We instead understand knowledge as being a process occurring within the real, within reality.
Something I'm wondering about is this distinction that he starts out the paragraph with between the energetic and the structural. I guess I want to try to interpret that, but it's hard to even know where to start. I guess energetic is connecting with, and we've talked about potential energy quite a bit, and it seems to me like maybe energetic is on the side of pre-individual, or on the side of a kind of potential that hasn't yet been actualized. And then the structure seems to be perhaps that in with the individuated, the concrete individualization that's resulted from a process of genesis. So energy, as it were, kind of pours itself out or works itself out in a structure. And then if, I think he was saying earlier, if no energy is left, all of it's individuated, then we have a complete individuation. But at that point, it seems the thing starts to recede into the past. It's no longer actively in process. I guess on the other hand, if all we have is energy and no structure, we have a kind of pure potential. And I don't know, maybe that's to be connected with the future in some sense, like open possibilities and that sort of thing. So that's how I'm parsing that, but I'm not, I don't know if that's, if that's exactly those are the right terms.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. And so that passage, that first line of the paragraph, however, the individual conceals two fundamental dynamisms, one of which is energetic and the other of which is structural. That line points back to the previous paragraph and the one before it. In those two paragraphs, he criticizes the hylomorphic schema for accounting for only the one side, the single fundamental dynamism, as he puts it, at the bottom of 74. So that the hylomorphic schema only deals with the what he calls here the hylomorphic encounter. So the relationship between a microphysical condition of the system, which we call matter, and a macrophysical structure, which we call form. So the hylomorphic schema only deals with that side, but it doesn't deal with the other side, which is the formation of the structure through the interaction of those two levels or two orders of magnitude, and that's the dark zone of the hylomorphic schema, is that intermediate order of magnitude. So I think that's sort of what he's pointing to with those two fundamental dynamisms. But the transition from that to the next, the epistemological reflection, is a little bit loose. I think it's not a very tight transition.
So, Nan, are you suggesting that this micro and macro align to some extent to the energetic and the structural? Or are they kind of orthogonal, like the two distinctions? Yeah, I was just going to add it because we have seen before this interplay between the disparate levels, right? The macro and the micro, and that seems to play a role, I guess, in individuation itself. It seems to be a kind of the dynamic in some sense of individuation. But yeah, I was wondering if you see those as aligned.
I think they're sort of orthogonal to each other, in the sense that so the energetic dynamism. So he says there's two fundamental dynamisms. One is energetic, and the other is structural. So the energetic dynamism, if we go back to the preceding paragraph, he says energetic transformations there. So this is the hylomorphic schema, the way that, or the hylomorphic situation, I think would be more precise. So it's the way that we have these two orders of magnitude without communication between them initially, and then we have the establishment of that communication, which is the initiation of individuation. So again, this is like the example of the brick. You have the order of magnitude of the mold, and then you have the order of magnitude of the clay, and then you pack the clay into the mold, and that institutes the communication between the two orders of magnitude. But he says, so this is only one of the fundamental dynamisms, is that relationship between the microphysical and the macrophysical, or between the two orders of magnitude. And then the other fundamental dynamism of individuation is the structural one. So this has to do with the crystallization example. So it's the way that the unindividuated or the pre-individual comes to be structured through this transductive process, or this structuration process. And then he goes on to say that the individual stability is the stability of their association. So there's some sort of relationship between these two dynamisms, or these two different forms of individuation, that constitutes the stability of an individual. So the persistence of an individual through time. Yes, I can read the next paragraph, which I think takes us to the end. Yes, to the end of the section. The epistemological postulate of this study is that the relation between two relations is itself a relation. Here we take the word relation in the sense defined above, which, opposing relation to the simple rapport, gives it the value of being. For relation persists in beings as a condition of stability and defines their individuality as resulting from an operation of individuation. If this postulate of the method of the study of constitutive relations is accepted, it then becomes possible to understand the existence and validity of an approximate knowledge. Approximate knowledge is not completely different from exact knowledge, it is merely less stable. Every scientific doctrine at any moment can become metastable with respect to a doctrine that has become possible due to a change in the conditions of knowledge. This, however, does not mean that the preceding doctrine should be considered false. It is also not logically negated by this new doctrine. Its domain is merely submitted to a new structuration that leads it to stability. This doctrine is neither a form of pragmatism nor a new logical empiricism, for it does not suppose the usage of any criterion external to this relation that knowledge is, like intellectual utility or vital motivation. No commodity is required to validate knowledge. It is neither nominalist nor realist, for nominalism or realism can only be understood in doctrines that suppose that the absolute is the highest form of being, and in doctrines that attempt to conform all knowledge to the knowledge of the substantial absolute. This postulate that being is the absolute underpins the dispute over universals conceived as a critique of knowledge. However, Abelard has fully perceived the possibilities of separating the knowledge of terms from the knowledge of relation. Despite the unintelligent jokes to which he has been submitted, he has brought forth with this distinction an extremely fruitful principle that takes on its full meaning with the development of the experimental sciences. Nominalism for the knowledge of terms, realism for the knowledge of relation. This is the method that we can gain from Abelard's teaching in order to apply it by universalizing it. This realism of relation can thus be grasped as the postulate of research. If this postulate is valid, it is legitimate to ask the analysis of a particular point of the experimental sciences to reveal to us what physical individuation is. The knowledge that these sciences give us is in fact valid as knowledge of relation and can only give to philosophical analysis a being consisting in relations. But if the individual is precisely such a being, this analysis can reveal it to us. One could object that we are seeking a particular case and that the reciprocity between the epistemological postulate and the known object prevents legitimizing this arbitrary choice from outside. But we specifically believe that every thought, precisely to the extent that it is real, is a relation, i.e. includes a historical aspect in its genesis. A real thought is self-justifying, but not justified before being structured. It includes an individuation and is individuated, thereby possessing its own degree of stability. In order for a thought to exist, it requires not just a logical condition, but also a relational postulate that allows for its genesis to be accomplished. If we can resolve other problems in other domains with the paradigm that the notion of physical individuation constitutes, we could consider this notion as stable. If not, it will merely be metastable, and we will define this metastability with respect to the more stable forms we could have discovered. It will then conserve the prominent value of an elementary paradigm. So again, we're continuing with epistemology in this paragraph. And we see here some discussion of the nominalism versus realism debate that we talked about a little bit earlier in our discussion. So again, this was a debate within medieval philosophy as to whether something like forms had, or ideas, or universals had existence independent of the particulars in which they inhere. And so Simondon characterizes his position as neither nominalist nor realist. And then he goes on a little bit later to say, to describe it as nominalism for the knowledge of terms and realism for the knowledge of relation. And so I think how we should understand that, or how we can interpret what that means, is that we understand entities through that relationship, that relation of knowledge, or to put it another way, knowledge itself is a relation in being, and so the process of knowledge, the development of knowledge, is self-justifying in that sense, because it insofar as it reaches a stable state, it is not subject to further transformation, and so in that sense, because knowledge is constitutive of being, of the total system, then we don't have this worry or this problem of whether we can know entities as they are in themselves, whether that be particulars or universals. It's in our knowledge, or in that knowledge relationship, that particulars and universals both obtain, I guess we could say. And so here, a little bit further down on the page here, he states that experimental sciences can only reveal what is relative. So it can only give a knowledge of relations, but precisely because individuals are constituted by their relations, or the relations are constitutive of the individual. Therefore, we can have knowledge of the individual through experimental sciences, or at least experimental sciences are not excluded from the individual in some absolute sense, as a phenomenalist position would hold.
I have a question about the physical individuation. So is that like the emerging, what exactly means here physical individuation is?
Well, actually, that's basically the whole, this whole first part of the book is outlining what physical individuation is, but more specifically, the physical individuation is the process through which something unindividuated, like the sulfur example, something unindividuated comes to take on structure, like the crystallization of the sulfur. So we have a potential energy which allows for transformation of the system in such a way that structure appears. And that's the sort of paradigm of physical individuation. And as he puts it right at the end of that passage that we just read, this role of being a paradigm means that it plays, that concept itself plays the role of a structural germ, which can bring about individuation in other domains of knowledge, which can therefore move those other forms of knowledge into a state of greater stability. So the physical individuation as a concept, or the notion of physical individuation, itself brings about a process of individuation in other domains of knowledge, and that's what constitutes its value as a paradigm.
So it has to do with more like a form and structure, like the change of a form and structure to generate some energy, potential energy. Isn't it?
Not to generate potential energy, but it's sort of the other way around. It's so the potential energy pre-exists in the system before individuation. So in the solution, in the sulfur, liquid sulfur, it contains potential energy, which is then used in the transformation into a crystalline state or into a structured state. So the potential energy pre-exists before the individuation process, and then it undergoes the system undergoes transformation into a structured state through that the use of that potential energy.
Yeah, in a way, it's very understandable, but at the same, it's kind of a non-understandable because Simondong seems to the ensemble like a combination of the form and the matter, and then try to understand the individuation as the amalgamation of the form and matter. But here, physical individuation, this concept gives me an idea like he's trying to differentiate the process, like as a in the level at the level of like a form. So in terms of like a change of structure, it brings about some other changes, something like that. So that's the part like it's understandable and non-understandable, something like that. Kind of a little bit confusing here.
Yeah, we'll continue to see more about the process of physical individuation throughout the rest of this chapter. But it's important also to distinguish between the hylomorphic schema, or the technical individuation that we have in the example of the brick, where we have form and matter, the relationship or the imposition of a form onto a matter. We have to distinguish that from the true process of physical individuation, like in the example of crystallization. So it's this crystallization example that he wants to use as the paradigm, and the hylomorphic situation is a sort of special case where we have something like a form and matter that are different orders of magnitude, and then we institute a communication between those two orders of magnitude. That's a sort of special case, and shouldn't be taken as the paradigm that other cases are compared to. It's the crystallization example that we should take as the paradigm. So when you read physical individuation, you should always think of the crystallization example. Yeah. So Angus had a good comment in the chat here about it's strange that the stable system is the model for knowledge, since the examples that we've seen of stable systems are the interior of the crystal and the brick, and both of them are characterized as being past, as being sort of results of individuation that are no longer undergoing individuation. And yeah, so I think that's a good, a fair point to make, because I think if we want to characterize knowledge, or what makes something adequate knowledge as opposed to inadequate knowledge, or approximate knowledge, I think the adequacy is not strictly or is not exhausted by something like stability, because another aspect of what makes something adequate knowledge is precisely its capacity to its fruitfulness, or something like that, a capacity to bring about transformation of other domains of knowledge. So Yeah, I think we could maybe push back a little bit on this point and see the capacity to undergo future transformation as being part of what makes knowledge adequate, rather than something like a stable state as being the adequate condition of knowledge. But yeah, that would be an interesting point to develop more and see what how it fits in with the rest of Simondon's system. Okay, so I think we can go on to the next subsection here, which we won't have time to finish today, I don't think, but we still have 15 minutes or so we can get started. If someone would like to read the first couple paragraphs of this subsection.
Subsection 2, individuation as the genesis of crystalline forms starting from an amorphous state. Is this manner of envisioning individuality still valid for defining the difference of crystalline forms relative to the amorphous state? If energetic conditions were the only ones to be considered, the answer would immediately be positive, for the passage from the amorphous state to the crystalline state is always accompanied by an energy exchange. At constant pressure and temperature, the passage from the crystalline state to the liquid state is always accompanied by an absorption of heat. There is presumably a latent heat of melting for the crystalline substance that is always positive. If, on the other hand, structural conditions alone were required, no new difficulty would be presented. The genesis of the crystalline form closest to the amorphous state could be assimilated to any passage whatsoever from one allotropic crystalline form to another. However, when we consider the difference between a substance in the amorphous state and the same substance in the crystalline state, it seems that the preceding definition of physical individuation is applicable only with a certain number of transformations or specifications. These modifications or specifications stem from the fact that the amorphous state cannot be treated as individual, and that the absolute genesis of the individuated state is more difficult to define than its relative genesis through the passage from a metastable to a stable form. The previously studied case then becomes a particular case vis-a-vis this more general case. Should I just read to the end of this page, I guess? Or should we stop there?
Yeah, you can read the end of the page.
Okay. The passage to the crystalline state from an amorphous state can be formed in different ways. A solution that evaporates until saturation, vapors that condense on a cold wall, sublimation, or the slow cooling of a melted substance can lead to the formation of crystals. Can it be claimed that the discontinuity between the amorphous state and the crystalline state is sufficient for determining the individuated nature of this state? This would be to suppose that there is a certain symmetry and equivalence between the amorphous state and the crystalline state, which is not proven. In fact, we indeed observe a stage in the variation of physical conditions, temperature change, for example, while the crystals are forming, indicating that an energetic change occurs. But it is important to note that this discontinuity can be fragmented and not given en masse in certain cases, like those of organic substances with complex molecules. For example, para-azoxyanisole. According to G. Friedel, these bodies, which are called liquid crystals by the physicist Lehmann who discovered them, present mesomorphic states that are intermediate between the amorphous state and the pure crystalline state. In their mesomorphic states, these substances are liquid but present properties of anisotropy. For example, optical anisotropy, as M. Moquin has shown. On the other hand, it is possible to obtain the same type of crystals starting from a concentrated solution of melted liquid that is left to cool down, or starting from a sublimation. It is therefore not with respect to the amorphous substance that the crystal consequently individualizes. The veritable genesis of a crystal as an individual is instead to be sought in the dynamism of the relations between the hylomorphic situation and a singularity.
So here he's relativizing to some extent what he's discussed in the last subsection. Whereas previously we were looking at the relationship between one crystalline state of sulfur or whatever other substance, one crystalline state and another, and how one state is metastable with relation to the other. Here now we want to look at the relationship between the amorphous state of the substance and the crystalline state, and what exactly that relationship is. So here, as he says, we have to transform or specify the previous understanding of physical individuation. So we'll continue to see that transformation as we read through the rest of this subsection. The basic the problem, I guess, is that we can't treat the amorphous state as an individual, so that what we saw earlier was a relative genesis of an individual through the passage from metastable to stable state. But what we're looking at now, or what we're trying to understand now, is an absolute genesis of an individual. So out of an amorphous state that is not individuated into a state that is individuated. So he gives examples of or he raises the question in that next paragraph of the discontinuity between amorphous and crystalline state. So is the individuality of the crystalline state, or is what makes the crystalline state individual the fact that it's discontinuous from the amorphous state? And he says that this is not, or this is a hypothesis that we can't prove, or that hasn't been proven yet. And he points out that we do, in fact, observe certain intermediate states, like these liquid crystals that he points to. So they're liquid in the sense that they can flow like any other liquid, but they have this property of optical anisotropy, meaning that light waves don't pass through it in the same way in all directions, whereas something like water, light waves will just pass through it in the same way in all directions. It's isotropic in that sense. Whereas these liquid crystals have different directions within them, so light passes through it in a different way depending on what angle it's going through the substance. And as Angus has pointed out, liquid crystals are used in computer monitors. LCD monitors are liquid crystal displays. So this has a technical value to it as well.
Yeah, I guess the difficulty I have with this section is I don't really understand why we're considering these. Maybe I misunderstood what you were just saying, but these sort of in between states, or why the existence of like these liquid crystals problematizes what we were talking about earlier. If we're only taking it as kind of the kind of crystallization we were looking at earlier is just kind of a paradigmatic. Just one way of looking at individuation. I guess I don't see why it matters that it holds for all kinds of crystallization.
So there's 2 points here, I think, that we have to set out. So there's first is the the relativity of the previous example. So in the previous subsection, we were looking at the passage from one crystalline form to another in these allotropic substances, so that we had one form is metastable in relation to another because it's subject to transformation, further transformation. So that, in that sense, it's a relative individuation because it's passing from one individuated state to another individuated state. And then now he wants to examine what happens if we instead want to look at an absolute genesis of individuation, so that we're passing from something which doesn't have the characteristics of an individual or the quality of an individual, the amorphous state of the substance, passing into something that does have a quality of individuality. So that means that we're dealing with a more general problem, or the problem is at a higher level of generality, rather than just being a relative individuation. We're dealing with absolute individuation. So that's the first point. So that's why we're sort of going back to the drawing board here in this subsection. And then the second point is what these liquid crystals are doing here, or what's the relevance of these liquid crystals. So the where it intervenes in the I want to say dialectic, even though that's not a term that Simondon would use, but in the evolution of the concepts here. So if we start from this problem of how absolute individuation or the absolute genesis of individuality occurs from an amorphous state to a crystalline state, one answer to that question could be that the discontinuity between the amorphous and the crystalline state could be what accounts for that individuation, so that you would have a discontinuous transition from amorphous to crystalline state, which would be the sort of boundary of individuation. But then these liquid crystals show that answer doesn't work. So there isn't, in fact, a discontinuity between the amorphous state and the crystalline state, because we have these liquid crystals which are intermediate between the two. So one possible answer to the question of what constitutes the individuality of the crystalline state as opposed to the unindividuated amorphous state, one possible answer to that question has been raised and now excluded because of these liquid crystals. And then we'll have to see further as we proceed through this subsection what alternative answers there are.
So it sounds like with this new problem of the absolute genesis, so it sounds like a distinction that's in the background here is between the metastable state and the amorphous state. It seems like those are distinct in an important way, because it seemed like the metastable is implicated in the relative genesis, right? Whereas the amorphous is implicated in the absolute genesis. And I suppose maybe the upshot is that the metastable state has some degree of individuation, or is kind of on the way of individuation, whereas the amorphous, it hasn't even begun.
I think I would state that a little bit differently. I think yeah, Angus, I think you're right in the chat there. I think the amorphous state is metastable as well. So you have metastability both in the case of the relative genesis and in the absolute genesis. But in the case of relative genesis, you starting from, as you said, Al Dreams, you start from something that already has the character of individuation or individuality to some degree. So you start from a form which already has that characteristic of individuality, but it's not fully individuated. So it's still metastable. And then you have a passage to a further degree of stability. Whereas in the case of absolute genesis, we're starting from an amorphous state, which also has the property of metastability, but then undergoes a process of individuation and results in a more stable state. So there's metastability in both cases at the outset, that and then the system undergoes the transformation through that genesis, whether it's relative or absolute. Okay, so we're just about at time. So I think we should probably stop here for today. So we'll start from, where did we get to? Yeah, the top of 79 next week. So thank you everyone for your contributions and for participating, and I'll see you all next week.